Last Sunday, we heard about the Christian duty and obligation to practice what we call fraternal correction. I mentioned that admonishing the wayward is listed among the so-called spiritual works of mercy. And by implication, we also mentioned that if you do not do anything to correct someone whom you know is doing something wrong, that is to be considered as a sin of omission. Yesterday, we heard what I call a conscious effort on the part of Jesus to balance fraternal correction as a moral duty. Even as we admonish the wayward, we also have to make sure we do not do it in a judgmental way. Bawal ang judgmental. Remember the famous lines of Jesus yesterday. Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Because the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you. You see, brothers and sisters, there is a very thin line that distinguishes righteousness from self-righteousness. One is positive, the other is negative. And there are many instances in the Gospels when Jesus himself was judged or condemned by the vanguards of righteousness in Israelite society, such as by the Pharisees. You know, they say the Navajo Indians of the American Southwest have a saying that goes, when you point an accusing finger on somebody, do not forget that 3 others are pointing at you. That's interesting. When you point an accusing finger on somebody, do not forget that 3 others are pointing at you. I think this is basically what Jesus himself meant when he told the men who wanted the woman caught in adultery to be stoned to death as prescribed by the Torah or the law of Moses. The gospel tells us, Jesus said in reply, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone." And they all went away. You know, one time, there was a priest who told me that he was approached by one parishioner after Mass. Apparently, the lady parishioner complimented him for his beautiful homily. This is what she said. Let me say it first in Tagalog. She said in Tagalog, "Ang dami pong tinamaan sa homily ninyo, Father. Sana matauhan sila." In English, "Father, your homily was bullseye. It hit a lot of people I know. I wish it will really awaken them." And the priest smiled but felt disappointed. He restrained himself from answering the parishioner, "But it was meant for you, my dear." Ikaw yung tinutukoy ko, but he didn't say it. This morning, I was a guest at the Radio Veritas in the program of Angelique Lazo and Father Luciano Feloni. And Father Luciano shared his reflection on the gospel. He called attention to what he called the funny way in which Jesus expressed his criticism of the common human tendency to do fraternal correction in a manner that is not only judgmental, but sometimes even hypocritical. And he was right. It looks like one of the reasons why Jesus was able to criticize people constructively was he often also did it with a sense of humor. Listen to how he said it jokingly. Jokingly. He said something to this effect. Imagine, you can notice the speck in another person's eye and miss the whole log or beam in your own eye. Of course, he's exaggerating. Can you even imagine a whole log in your eye? And most likely, he said this with the deliberate intention of making his audience laugh so that he could make them think seriously about it afterwards. In another instance, he spoke about people who go out of their way, he says, to strain a tiny mosquito from their insect while they swallow a whole camel. Can you swallow a camel? And once, he preached against the tendency to be too preoccupied with material things. Ang sabi niya, look at the birds of the sky. They do not sow nor reap. They do not gather into barns. Hindi daw nagfa-farming ang mga ibon. Or look at the lilies of the fields. They do not work or spin or weave clothes. But even King Solomon, in his glory, was never dressed like any one of these lilies of the field. He says it in a funny way, talking about birds doing farming or wildflowers weaving clothes, because it is easier for people to take it that way, with a grain of humor. This must be the reason why St. Paul says in our first reading that even if he preaches the gospel, it is no reason for him to boast. And I agree with St. Paul. Sometimes, in the middle of our own preaching, you feel convicted by the very words that you utter. Minsan, napapaaray din kami. And so, he says, to the weak, I made myself weak in order to win the weak. In the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 12, the writer says, for the word of God is living and active. It is living and active. Incidentally, somebody was asking me if I could give him permission to share my homilies. And I said, oh, please go ahead. There is no copyright to the Word of God. It is meant to be shared. The Word of God is powerful. It is living and active, but very sharp. It is sharper than a two-edged sword, according to the writer. It penetrates even to dividing the soul and the spirit, the joints and the marrow. It judges the thoughts and the intentions of the heart. A two-edged sword. If the Word of God can cut through the mind of the hearer, the other edge can cut through the soul of the preacher himself.